Everybody, happy Wednesday, and welcome to another Iceni webinar for change. So this is the third webinar in our series. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This evening, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Megan Hurst. Megan is a social psychologist. She currently lectures at the University of Sussex. She's also a world famous ultimate player, teammate, current, past, present teammate of mine, and it is absolutely amazing to have her here. So, as a reminder, Megan is going to be talking to us today about what we do now, so motivation and goal setting for an unpredictable season. And I'm sure we can all agree this has been a totally bananas season, so this is guaranteed to be a great session for everyone. Another reminder, just as a nice plug, we are hosting these webinars as part of as part of an initiative to support two charities. So the two charities that we as Iceni have chosen are Show Racism, the Red Card, and the Baytree Centre. Show Racism, the Red Card is an anti-racism education charity which uses the high-profile nature of footballers as anti-racist role models to educate against racism throughout society in the UK. They provide educational workshops, training sessions, and a whole host of other resources with the purpose of tackling racism in society. The second charity that we are supporting this evening is the Baytree Centre. It is a social inclusion charity for women and girls based in Brixton, South London. They provide holistic support through personal development activities and workshops, including mentoring and coaching, to support newly arrived migrant and refugees. So the Baytree empowers women and girls to realize their full potential and aims to equip them with the skills they need to be successful and flourish in life. These are two absolutely amazing causes, and so we encourage you all to donate to both of them by using the QR codes on your right, should be around here. And if those don't work for you, which they did not work for me, you can also get the links through the description on YouTube. So you can make a donation through Just Giving on there. And without any further ado, I am going to hand over to Dr. Hurst. So, Meg, please take it away.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Fee. Just while I start sharing my screen, I will tell everyone a little bit about myself. So, as Fee mentioned, I'm a lecturer in social psychology at the University of Sussex, but I also dabble in sport and exercise psychology, and my research and my teaching sits somewhere at kind of the nexus between those. So I've worked on goals, motivations for exercise, and more generally, so motivation and goals in a kind of life context. And my work typically focuses around women's experiences of sport and exercise. In terms of ultimate, I've played at all levels of ultimate, from total beginner who literally didn't know how to run, to representing GB on the international stage. And I've also coached at a variety of levels, from beginners to university to club, elite, across women's open and mixed divisions. And so I'm hoping today's session, because of that, will be helpful for players and for coaches across those levels and divisions. And slightly grandiosely, I guess, I'm kind of trying to think about this being useful now, but also in normal times, as it were. So I'm hoping to kind of use this session as a way of talking about some general goal setting and motivation research, but also thinking about what that tells us for now. And just before we get started, I want to say a big thanks to the Iceni committee and everyone that's been involved in running these sessions. There's so much logistical work going on behind the scenes. And also just to remind you to donate, because that's what we're here for. So today's webinar, what we're actually talking about. So I want to talk about goal setting and motivation, and particularly why it's difficult at the moment. And I also want to talk a little bit about sort of just dipping into some of the sports psychology literature, outlining how sports psychologists have been working with particularly Olympic athletes. There's a lot around that particular situation out there in the research literature at the moment, but I also think it's relevant for ultimate players, particularly for people who've really been gearing up on this kind of 4-year cycle, targeting World Ultimate and Guts Championship, and then obviously having to kind of go through that process of experiencing, okay, well, it's cancelled this year and now it's postponed until next year. So I want to start a little bit by kind of thinking about or talking about like some features of COVID-19 or kind of the coronavirus pandemic as an event in athletes' careers. And so in terms of the 2019-2020 season, what are the things we've experienced this year? So it was unpredictable. No one knew it was coming. And in the kind of predictable sequence of sporting events that people are used to experiencing, this is not something that is planned into the cycle, kind of unsurprisingly. Kind of unusually for sort of athlete career events, it's a shared event. So it's truly a global pandemic versus, for example, something that's been more localized in the past, like Ebola obviously influencing athletes from Africa quite significantly. SARS really influencing South Asian athletes as well. Whereas actually this time we're looking at a global pandemic. And so this has been very much a global shared situation for athletes. Although I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the variations in a second. But certainly the kind of shared nature of entire events being cancelled because of it is something that athletes have. And also, it's been uncertain. So lots of athletes' plans have been thrown up in the air, and it's been difficult to replan because it's been hard to kind of identify, really what's going on and what's going to keep going on. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting that I just want to kind of pick out is I'm talking about it as like a career event for athletes, and other sort of big career events or career transition literature looks a lot at injury, for example. And so it's been picked up as similar. I think lots of people will have seen this in the sports media. But it's a bit controversial in the sports psychology community to kind of talk about it in comparison to injury. And part of that is because it shares that unpredictable nature and that uncertain nature. So when you're injured, it is unpredictable, it kind of just happens sometimes. And then also it's uncertain because often it's hard to tell when you're going to be able to come back. But the thing that's really missing with injury is that shared nature is relatively uncommon for all the competitors to experience the same injury at the same time. So the other thing that I think it's important to kind of note is that people's athletic identity or their self-perception as an athlete, both of those are damaged by injury or in jeopardy from injury and also from COVID-19 in that it's removing those competitive opportunities. But actually, we'll come back to this a little bit later, but COVID-19 actually is almost more threatening than injury because it's threatening other identities and features of life as well. So people's sort of identification as a family member, people's sense of themselves as a student, for example. Education has been hugely disrupted. And so we'll come back to that. But I think it's really important for coaches to remember that it's not just participants' athletic identities that have been challenged during this time. But one similarity that I do want to pick up with pretty much all of the career transition literature around injuries, around retirement, is that it all suggests that this is likely to be a perilous time for athletes' mental health. So lack of direction after a prolonged period of focus on high performance goals typically puts athletes at risk for mental health difficulties. And the kind of emerging evidence that we've seen from early in the pandemic, for example, with professional footballers in March and April, suggests that there are higher rates of subclinical and clinical depression and anxiety among those players during that early lockdown period compared to other times. So it's not good. And these are some of the features of it. So we're now, certainly for the UK season, I know it's a bit different in the States, we're kind of starting to look forward and moving into the kind of 2020, 2021 season. Certainly for me, I'm looking at coaching a university team next season. And so I'm starting to try and think about what this is going to do to essentially this coming season as well. And I think things have changed a little bit. So it is to a certain extent predictable. So we know that COVID-19 is going to affect our seasons. We just don't know exactly how. I think as the season progresses, we're going to see more variation in circumstances. So it's not so shared. how it's affecting people anymore. And that's going to vary by country. So we'll see some countries come out of lockdown and return to competitive play earlier than others. And it's also going to vary within country by location, but also across communities. So we know that in the UK, there's been a disproportionate burden from coronavirus on Black and minority ethnic communities and people in more precarious employment. And even just within the GB women's team, we've had some people furloughed, like we've had a real range. We've had some people furloughed, so they've had all this time, but also all this boredom. And then we've, in contrast, also had some people working really crazy hours, sometimes in quite stressful home working setups. So it's affecting people differently. And I think it's going to keep getting more different. So the kind of final thing, which is the same as last season, is that there's still that uncertainty. And actually, there's possibly more uncertainty. So certainly early in lockdown. So when the UK went into lockdown, many of us were pretty certain that that was it for Worlds that year. And that was confirmed relatively quickly for us. So actually, we got some certainty during that season. Whereas actually now, I think it feels a little bit more in flux. So there's maybe a second wave looming. There are local lockdowns imminent, almost certainly, but we don't know where. And although we're seeing those sporting events rearranged, like World Ultimate and Guts Championship, there's this lingering sense of doubt about whether these are going to happen, and if so, in what form. So I just want to highlight that this is kind of the season that we're going into. And these are some things to kind of bear in mind. So it's predictable that we're going to have some uncertainty, essentially. So why does that matter for goal setting and motivation? And to really explain that, I want to come back to some of the basics of goal setting. So this is one of those things which hopefully will stand you in good stead for your future seasons as well, in normal times, as well as in this kind of weird time. So I want you to take a moment and think about a goal that you wanted to achieve last season. And what was it? And I just want you to try and, if you've got a computer or a pen and paper handy, just try writing it down so that you've actually got it written out in front of you. And you can kind of refer back to it and kind of have a look at where you think that fits in some of the kind of categories that we're going to be talking about in a second. So what was your goal for the 2019-2020 season? So I'm going to show you some example goals just while you're writing yours down. So you might have thought, I would like to be better at Ultimate. That is my goal. My goal is to be better at Ultimate. You might have had a goal of throwing a 10-meter flick, even just one time in a game. You might have had a goal of finishing in the top 8 at World Ultimate and Guts Championships. Sorry to Ashio for the lack of ambition in that goal there. You might also have had a goal of having 0 turnovers from static discs. It's probably more a handler goal. And you might also have had the goal, so this one here is one of my goals from the previous season, so throwing every day in the month leading up to Euros. So we've got this kind of range of goals. And so if you have a look at your own goal, you might see that there are some similarities with some of these and some differences. And if you've done goal setting before, if you're used to it, or if you've sat through some painful management seminars at work one time, you might have made a SMART goal. So SMART goals, this is this kind of sort of an, I don't know why it annoys me as an acronym, but it does, but it's quite a useful way of remembering how to set useful goals. So you want a goal to be specific. So unfortunately, my first goal, which is pretty much, my baseline goal for every season since I started, is be better at Ultimate. But that's not very helpful in directing our behavior because it's not specific. It's not focusing on a particular thing. It's not measurable. How am I going to know at the end of the season whether I have been better at Ultimate? It might be attainable. It might be realistic. And attainable and realistic kind of overlap a little bit. But timely is also a really interesting one in terms of thinking about the timescale that you're looking over. So goals that are set far, far in the future are actually quite hard to keep motivating yourself towards. And you'll notice that actually across this set of goals that I've sort of given you here, these are quite varied in terms of the timescale that they're working over. And also some of them don't have a timescale. So actually, if I was going to smartify these goals, then there would be some adjustments to make. The last one is probably the closest to being a proper SMART goal in this set of examples. So if I just want us to start thinking a bit more about the differences. So obviously there are differences in the levels. So I think the second one in this list was probably my goal for the first 3 months of playing Ultimate. So that's kind of like a beginner level goal. Obviously there's no sense in a beginner kind of striving to be in the top 8 at World Ultimate and Guts Championship. So that's some realism coming into play, I guess. But what I want us to start thinking about is recognizing that these are kind of operating at different levels as well. And so we might want to think about goal hierarchies. So we'll start with outcome goals. So an outcome goal is the big thing that you want to achieve. And outcome goals are often in sports contexts, we see them as finishing positions, although I'm going to talk a little bit more in a second about how you might start thinking about reframing those. They're dependent on others. So you don't win worlds without beating other people. So it's not entirely within your control. So an example of one of this from the last page was thinking about that goal of finishing in the top 8 at Worlds. So coming down, now performance goals are kind of measurements or kind of check-ins that will indicate that you're on track for that outcome goal. And it's usually a specific accomplishment that's unrelated to other people. And this is why sometimes these are actually quite difficult to generate in Ultimate or team sport, because you can't necessarily just use percentages because there's so much else going on. So one example that's kind of close to a performance goal, depending on how we're framing it and how we time specify it, might be the static discs the goal that I mentioned on the previous slide. And so these goals are relatively within your control. And they're kind of a building block towards your big outcome goals for the season. And then the process goals, these are the things you're going to do to get there. And here we're talking about typically specific behaviors or habits. And so a really clear example of this is the throwing every day. As a coach, you might want to be more specific about what throwing you're getting people to do. So again, this is about kind of smartifying your goals. But this is these kind of building block behaviors. But what's important to know is that you have to know what you're doing with these different things. So it's not just a case that you can, if you pick a good outcome goal that's realistic for you, you'll automatically achieve it. Actually, the trick to good goal setting is to knowing how to build up this hierarchy. So you start from the outcome goal and you work down, okay, so what do I need to be able to see myself achieving at certain points in the season in order to hit that? Okay, what do I need to be doing for the rest of the season in order to be at those certain points? So an example I often use if I'm teaching this with undergraduate students would be about the kind of structure that you put in for trying to win a 100-meter gold medal at the Olympics. But obviously the examples I give will be total dross because I do not know much about sprinting. So your day-to-day focus within a season is on your process goals. And that's because that distal goal of winning a championship or finishing in the top 8 is really hard to use as motivation because it's really hard to track your progress towards it. So you're not really checking in on it very often. And, you know, if you're aiming to win worlds, what are you doing? At every training session, you're like, have we won worlds yet? No. The answer is going to be no for a while as well. So your primary focus is on the process goals. Those are the things that are driving your day-to-day behaviors, everything in training. Your performance goals are things that you're checking in at across the course of the season. And then you're hoping that if you've set those up right, that will lead to your positive outcome goals. So that's kind of a bit of goal setting 101, just to kind of help you doing this. And one thing that I just want to pick up on, if we go back to these goals that I was talking about a second ago, some of these are individual goals. So be better at Ultimate. I guess you could have that as a team goal as well. So throwing a flick, for example. But the others could all be, some of them could be individual goals. So 0 turnovers from static discs or throwing every day in the month leading up to Euros. That could be an individual goal, but they could also be team goals. So you can set team goals as well. And something that I think is really good is as a team having a kind of a powwow at the beginning of the season and actually going through this process of saying, well, what outcome do we want to achieve? What performance goals are we going to need in place? And then what process are we going to get through? And doing that as a team is really good for getting buy-in from everyone. So why is it so hard to do right now? So I've just mentioned the kind of team goal setting process that I would try and encourage a team to go through. And obviously the kind of how collaborative that is depends a little bit on the nature of the team. But normally in team goal setting, I would be looking for a team to agree an outcome goal that everyone's kind of bought into. And so the classic is a finishing position at a key tournament. And the kind of problem arises, I guess, right now in that, well, what if that tournament suddenly doesn't going to happen? Or what if it's maybe not going to happen? And so this uncertainty is actually really part of the difficulty in terms of setting up a good goal hierarchy. So is Worlds even going to happen? And actually the point at which Worlds is cancelled is not the point at which your troubles start. The point at which people are uncertain about Worlds is where the difficulty is. And so once you lose your outcome goal, obviously, if we think about that hierarchy, once you've lost your outcome goal, often your performance goals you might lose through not being able to attend any of the events that you might be using to check in at them. Suddenly your process goals feel a little bit meaningless because they're not feeding through into anything later. So losing your outcome goal is really tough. So a few things that you can think about are setting robust goals. So by robust goals, I mean things which are not tied to events that are sketchy this season. So goals that are achievable in the context that we're in, even as the context changes. The alternative to that is to think about having flexible goals. So being able to roll with the punches, as it were. So having perhaps if nationals happens, here's what we think our goal is going to be. If it doesn't, what do we want it to be? And actually having those conversations as a team. And one of the things we're going to talk about later from the sports psych literature is actually the importance of not just, having these ideas about flexible goals, but actually not just knowing that things are uncertain, but discussing that uncertainty as a team and as players and coaches. I guess one of the things I want to flag is that doesn't mean that you should set meaningless goals. Like it's okay to say we want to win nationals as a goal because we actually don't care about winning nationals. That's not a helpful thing to do. So set goals that you care about and that are meaningful. And it may be that the current context means that you don't care about winning stuff. And you care about other things. So, for example, Molly Brown is a really good example of a team in the States who their entire 2019-20 season goal shifted as a result of the pandemic towards a much more community-focused and activism-focused goal. And so that's a nice example of being flexible and also doing things which are important to you right now. The other thing I want to pick up just before we go on to talking a bit more about motivation is the kind of isolating nature of the pandemic. So, and I'm feeling this particularly as a kind of looking at going into a season as a coach. And there's this temptation when we're all having to be physically distant from each other, and it's complicated to think about how you train team strategies and team development. And actually, maybe you don't even ever have a chance to put those into practice. I think there's really a temptation to set only individual goals and individual development aims for your players. And I think actually one of the things that can really help is setting team goals, even in this climate. And one way that you can make sure that those are meaningful and not ones that are going to get washed away are team goals that will help the team long term. So that may well be about diversity, inclusion, learning together as a team around some of those important issues. So we're going to shift a little bit now from goal setting and move into motivation. And so I just want you to think about for a second, how motivated are you right now? And, you can use a scale of, let's say, 0 to 100. And maybe we'll be more specific. How motivated are you about Frisbee right now? So plot twist, from my perspective, this is an unhelpful question. And so talking about how much motivation people have is not as important as talking about what motivates people and why they're motivated. And so one of the key kind of theoretical areas that I work in really focuses on this idea of there being a what and a why behind people's motivation. So So if we're thinking about the why of motivation, there's this idea that we can be more externally motivated, so our why is outsiders, or we can be more internally motivated, our why is insiders. And there's this continuum that we move through as we internalize the reasons for doing a particular behavior. So we start over at this left-hand side of the slide where we're thinking about we do things because we want prizes, we want kind of this external reward, or we're trying to avoid criticism. We start slowly internalizing that. And I think about this next stage as really being like the internalized voice of your parents, where you don't really care about the thing yet, but you can hear your mother's voice as you do something bad. Then we might start to move towards more positive kinds of motivation. So recognizing the importance or the value of a behavior, even if we don't love the behavior itself. Then we start integrating that behavior into our identity. And then beyond that, the kind of purest or best form, most intrinsic form of motivation is about doing something because it's inherently enjoyable. The activity itself is its own reward. And what I really enjoyed actually is that in the webinars so far, if you haven't watched the other Iceni series webinars, they're both so fantastic. But actually, there's two really great examples that Tatenda gave and also that Fiona gave. And I want to kind of show you how those kind of fit here. So Tatenda was talking about kind of how spirit of the game and behaving spiritedly, why you want to be spirited, how that kind of develops and the evolution of how they thought about spirit. And so we start with spirit surprise, I want to win a thing. But then actually we progress through those stages. Hopefully we get to somewhere where we say, actually, spirit of the game is something I really value. It's something that's important to me. And that's why I'll behave in a spirited way. But it may also be that over the course of time, we get to a place where actually say, well, actually playing in a more spirited way is more enjoyable. And then the example, which is a bit of a gear shift from Fiona's webinar when she was talking about teeth brushing. Here we might think about, well, I'll feel guilty if I don't brush my teeth and I'll hear my mum's voice in my head nagging me, so I better go and do it. Versus all my teeth falling out is a good outcome, or not falling out, sorry, is a good outcome, and I'd like to keep my teeth in. And so teeth brushing is an example of something which, you know, there's probably relatively few people who find inherent enjoyment in brushing their teeth, but actually lots of people manage to do it, and it's because we've internalized the value of that. So as a coach, one thing that I would be looking to do is really tap into motivations at the right-hand side of this spectrum, so importance and value, identity and enjoyment, and try to avoid giving people reasons to do things which are around kind of external rewards or criticism and pride and guilt. So players feeling guilty at sessions would be my absolute worst nightmare as a coach, because I spent 3 years researching it for my PhD, and guilt is bad. That's the summary of 3 years of my life. So just really quickly, I just want to talk about intrinsic motivation. So this idea of an activity being inherently rewarding. And I think often we think about that as being fun. And to a certain extent, that's kind of an easy way of thinking about it. But we can also find things intrinsically rewarding if they offer us challenge, so they push us, if they offer us connection with other people, or they offer us kind of the ability to go into a flow state where we're not focusing, we're not thinking too hard, we're just able to be immersed in the activity. And so it's not just a case of this being fun. And so, for example, over lockdown, I've really got into running. And it's not that when I run, I'm like, yes, this is super fun. Actually, it's more about the challenge and the flow elements of that activity for me. Other people might find it fun. Other people might do it for connection reasons. But that just kind of gives us a bit of a sense there. So if we're thinking about promoting more internal motivation, particularly in coaching, this is something that I would think about. Autonomy, so letting people feel like they have control over their behaviors, or at least where you can't give them control, they understand why they're doing what they're doing. So offering choice and not control. And then as a coach, you can't always provide choice, particularly in the kind of COVID setting. But another way of promoting that internalization and providing an environment that supports people moving along that continuum is providing a rationale. So if people have to do something, explain to them why they have to do it. avoiding rigid self-control, this is more about encouraging people not to kind of mindlessly follow a training plan, and to actually remember to kind of give yourself some control over yourself as well. So competence, it's really important for people to feel like they're good at something and that they're improving at something. So as a coach, you want to be thinking about setting a level of challenge in your sessions that is achievable but challenging. And also as a player or as a coach, you want to offer ways for people to track their improvement. So actually recognizing your improvement over time is really important. And this links back to goal setting in terms of thinking about, actually, it's really important for our kind of, to be able to see that we're moving towards our goals, to actually track whether we are or not. And then finally, relatedness. So for me, when I'm building sessions, I want to find ways for them to allow my players to connect with each other at 2 meters distance, but not compete with each other. And so relatedness is really about building a climate which is about meaningful connection, rather than something which is more about social recognition or social competition. So as always, I have talked too much. So I'm going to talk about this very briefly, but the what of motivation, obviously the kind of classic extrinsic goal that we might worry about in research of money and fame, essentially, are not as available in Ultimate Frisbee. But other extrinsic goals, you might want to play Frisbee. You might play Frisbee because you think about weight loss and appearance, or about social recognition, so wanting people to say and see that you are the best. And I just want to encourage people to maybe take this kind of gap in time, as it were, to think about what intrinsic goals you have. So do you play because it allows you to connect with friends, because it enables you to kind of feel that ability to challenge yourself and kind of be the best you? Is it about engaging in healthy behaviors, or is it about giving something back to the community? And one of the most powerful things you can do in this moment is to think about not really trying to suppress your extrinsic goals, but thinking about the intrinsic goals that you have, and thinking about why they're important to you. And the more you can remind yourself of those things, the more that's going to help put you in a positive motivational place. So just very briefly to finish, I want to kind of touch on some of the sports psychology work that's been coming out recently. This kind of divides things into something of a pre-Olympic postponement and post-postponement. So what happened in the initial kind of kickoff of lockdown? So really we're kind of thinking about early part of the year through to once Olympic athletes knew that things were postponed. And actually the world cycle follows quite a similar sort of trajectory to this as well. So one of the first things, and hopefully that will have come through, is that actually being agile and accepting, recognizing the kind of uncertainty of now and being able to move with it is going to be really important for athletes this season. It was important last season, and it's important now. There's also quite an interesting situation that was happening in early 2020 and is now likely to be recurring as we go into the next season, in that non-shared limitations among competitors are going to become stressful for athletes. So being able to go on social media and see that, you know, one of your close competitors for a national title is able to train at the moment, or one of your close competitors for Euros, for Worlds, is able to have full team trainings, they're doing their selections. Actually, that's going to be quite stressful for athletes. And we need to think about how we're supporting them in that as coaches, or if they're your peers. And then this kind of other point is that in all of the early lockdown, there was such massive disruption beyond sport. And so huge areas of people's lives were disrupted. And I think for coaches, this is a really important thing for us to recognize, in that COVID is not the same as an injury, because it hasn't typically, I mean, obviously it depends on the scale of the injury, but often that can be limited to sport and people still have everything else in their lives. But actually there's such huge disruption, we need to be aware of that. So what can we do about some of these things? So I would really encourage a self-focus for athletes and for teams. So not self-centeredness as in like us, screw everyone else, but actually focusing on you and how can you make improvements? What can you do now? So not what are other people doing, what can you not do, but actually really focus on what you can do right now. And that's going to be useful across all levels, whether it's elite competitors to school programs to recruitment for the uni women's team, which is really where my head's at now. Don't sort of cry about what you've lost, think about what you can do. And I think that's really going to help. There's 3 helpful perspectives that I want to encourage. And I think this is helpful for athletes, but I think they're particularly useful for coaches when you're thinking about how you're interacting with people at the moment. So think about your athletes as whole people. So recognizing that it's not just athletics, it's not just ultimate frisbee in their lives at the moment. Actually, there's other stuff going on, and sometimes there's really huge other stuff going on. Thinking about athletes' whole careers. So not just, oh no, this season we were going to do X, Y, and Z. Actually taking a step back and essentially, I think, as a coach, being a little bit humble and recognizing that often you get to coach people for a really small window in their career. And if there's things you can do this season to help them on their way later, then now's a really good time to be thinking about that. And then also the whole environment. So actually the entire situation that we're in at the moment, actually recognizing that's the kind of the situation that we're in. And I guess overriding all of this, lots of the research is talking about, and lots of the reflection from practitioners is talking about the value of openness with athletes at the moment. So whether that's between coaches and athletes, whether that's with your teammates, and actually expressing your fears, the challenges you're facing, the frustrations, the uncertainty is really important right now, because that's going to help move you towards being able to address those rather than kind of keeping them bottled up. So after Olympic postponement, the question that all of the sports psychologists working in this particular paper posed their athletes was, if you could pause time in an Olympic year, what would you do? I think this question is a really nice way to think about, particularly if your athletes have just faced a cancellation of an event. And so there's kind of 2 things really that athletes spoke about, and that was rehabbing injuries or niggles properly when they'd been worried that they didn't have time to otherwise, or addressing gaps and weaknesses in their game that they weren't able to, those were things that they'd had to accept before the Olympics, and now actually they had a chance to address them. And these are definitely things that, for me, actually, the postponement of Worlds really allowed me to think about rehabbing sort of 3 different niggles that I'd picked up and was carrying, and was really starting to worry about going into the heavier part of the season. So really, this is about reframing. So focusing on the gain of time rather than the loss of competition. And it's also recognizing that this is kind of a chance to reevaluate what you're doing as a team and as individuals, and why you're doing it. And then finally, I just want to kind of finish, I guess, the kind of stuff that I've been talking about here with kind of a bit of a thought on this kind of gift of time. And Sitendra in the Diversity and Ultimate webinar talked about us having this gift of time. And actually, they said something that I thought was really powerful. And it's about actually not just keeping this gift for ourselves, but about spending it on other people. So if as a club, you've been really meaning to get your diversity policies in order, you've been meaning to think about trans inclusion policies, you've been meaning to think about what community outreach you can do, actually now is a really good time to start putting that planning work in. Use that gift of time well. So thank you to everyone for listening. Please do ask questions via the chat, and please do remember to donate as well, because they're such great causes, and we really care about them as a team at Iceni. Thanks very much. I think Fee's going to rejoin me, possibly.
I am. Thanks. That was awesome, Meg. That was such a great session. I learned so much, as always, from you. You are truly wise. And that's not a code word for anything else. You are genuinely very, very wise. Okay, well, while we wait for some questions to come in, so yeah, like Meg said, highly encourage you to, number one, ask questions, take advantage of the fact that we have an awesome doctor in our presence virtually, and also donate via the links and via the QR codes. But while we wait for that, I have a couple of questions of my own. So, sort of towards the end of this, you mentioned the value of openness, and how important that is, especially in this time, like for people to be open with each other. And in terms of practical things, what can coaches and captains and players do to kind of open those lines of communication or keep them open, and just encourage, openness?
I think it depends a little bit on your team structures and what you have in place already. So, for example, with this is more of an example from GB Women, like not from COVID times, but there was definitely a point last season where, like, essentially, I think I was starting to just pick up injuries and just be a bit run down, and I'd been bottling it up for ages, and then actually just kind of blurted it out, I think either at you or Hannah, one of the other captains. And actually even just the effect of speaking to that person that I had contact with in the team leadership was really important. So as an athlete, you can obviously initiate that and just splurge at your coach or your management team. And I really recommend it because it made me feel a lot better. But actually, one of the things that certainly in even in normal times is really useful to do. So, for example, going into a big tournament, having almost like a post-it note session, or you can use Google Jamboard, which Fee introduced me to over lockdown, and I'm now addicted to for teaching, which is like a kind of post-it notes online kind of thing. Actually, you can do that session as a team. And so you can, as a coach or a leader, you can pose a few different questions. So like, what are we stressing out about right now? What do we think might help? So you can kind of work through a series of kind of questions about how people are feeling. And I'm a social psychologist, so I always want to do stuff in groups. But actually, for teams, being able to share those things was really important. So when I was having my little freak out last season about being terrible at Ultimate, actually, it was really useful to talk to management and then be like, oh, yeah, there's some other people having freakouts about being terrible at Ultimate. I was like, well, everyone's great at Ultimate on this team. And so actually, like, sharing your experiences, whether it's COVID experiences or kind of what's going on over the course of a normal season is really useful, even though it's also quite scary to be kind of open and vulnerable with your team.
And if you, as a player, kind of recognize behavior, or you recognize that someone might be struggling with their mental health at the moment, what are some good ways that you can support them as an individual or even just as a team to reach out to someone that you think might need a little bit of support?
So certainly it depends a little bit, again, on the context of your team. So obviously lots of university teams have the advantage of being embedded within kind of the university wellbeing systems. So I'm really excited to going back to coaching uni this year. And so one thing that I know that I need to kind of have on hand is all of the wellbeing support and the kind of support that you can funnel students towards within the university. For broader teams, and I guess in general, in terms of opening up those conversations, it's kind of hard. You, as a team manager, depending on how well you know your players, you might know that they get on particularly well with another player, and you might say, hey, can you go and check in on this person? Or it might just be a case of kind of dropping them a message and saying, hey, how's it going? Like, you're a bit quiet at training, or you've been a bit quiet on the WhatsApp. And it might be that they reply with, I'm just really snowed under at work. Or it might be that sort of initial inquiry is what sort of opens the floodgates.
Nice, good answer. Okay, I've got another question for you. So one thing that I've always found quite difficult to manage as a captain in the past is kind of creating a team goal that acknowledges and recognizes different people's motivations for playing. So I find that sometimes a lot of players really struggle with an outcome related goal, like the goal for this team shouldn't be to win nationals or Euros or whatever it may be, whereas that is something that other people, that really resonates with others, and they really like that kind of quantitative outcome at the end. And going into like the sort of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators for people, where do you find that common ground, right? To sort of make sure that your goals are inclusive to everyone and yet satisfy different people's motivations?
I think it depends on, sometimes on the people you have within the team.
I realized that was a really difficult question, but
no, I mean, if I could answer that, I could make a lot of money as a sports psychologist.
Damn, all right.
Not as a sports psychologist, because you have to have a very specific qualification for that. So don't go around calling yourself a sports psychologist. But so it depends a bit how much time you have as a team. I think, like, certainly on teams that I've worked with, often you have, like, if people are like, oh, Megan, should we do some sports psychology stuff? Do you want half an hour at this training weekend? I'm like, whereas if you've got a bit more time and it's a bit more embedded into your kind of season plan, I think it certainly something I think is useful is to almost start before this season's goals, and to think about the team values. So this is certainly a kind of a values generating or sort of discussion session is something we did with Iceni this year. I think it was really useful because it lets people express the things that are important to them on the team. And then also everyone's then responsible for trying to make sense of how do we match up these different things that are important to people on the team. And so I think that kind of values-based process, so coming a little bit before like this season's goals, can really help to sort of get everyone on the same page, or at least to help everyone recognize that not everyone's on the same page. So if you have a team where there's this big core of people that talk to each other a lot and they're all talking about winning Euros, and then you've got like a little cluster of people who are like, let's have fun, that's going to be difficult. And I think also it's tricky to do good goal setting for that kind of outcome, like big season, like big idea level that isn't very performance focused, like that isn't kind of achievement focused. I think it really takes like skill as a team to kind of identify, okay, actually, like, what does it mean for us to like really achieve what we want to outside of placement? And that's a really hard question to answer, I think, for any team.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Yeah, I'll think of an easier one next time. All right, well, I'm going to implore the viewers of this webinar to give us some more questions, and if not, I will ask one final one before we let Meg get on with her evening. Any takers? All right, back to me then. No worries.
Oh, I've got one question.
Have you got one?
Just come through. Actually, I think there might be a few that Nos is sending through to us. Thanks, Nos. So Nos has asked, what are some good ways to support your team who might be struggling with their mindset right now? So mindset's quite a broad church, I guess, in terms of like what we might mean by that. I guess, so I talked about motivation and different kinds of motivation. I think there's also a kind of group of people, and definitely at the beginning of lockdown, it was the zero motivation bucket. So although there are different types of motivation, you can just like flatline. And I think supporting those players right now is really hard, particularly people who are so used to kind of striving towards goals. And I think as teammates, I think one thing that you can do, and one thing that I think is just good in terms of a mental health perspective, is if your teammates are struggling, ask them what they enjoy doing, and then try and support them and encourage them to do that. And whether that's in a Frisbee context or whether it's different activities, like within physical activity or outside of that, I think that's a really kind of good place to start. But if you've got people who are just kind of paralyzed and like, I've got no motivation to do anything. So yeah, just starting with something that you enjoy. Again, like kind of thinking about those motivational backgrounds is going to be really important. I think Nos has sent us through another one as well. So this is from Peter Robert Wright. Do you have any practical advice for running a team goal setting session so that you successfully narrow down on some goals? And does this only work with squads as opposed to bigger clubs? Yeah, so I'm trying to think. So typically I've run this with teams. So certainly the value session we've run with Iceni, and then with Brighton City a few years ago, we ran a kind of goal setting session. In terms of practical advice, I think obviously if it's you running it and you know your players and you know who's going to rile who up, sometimes you can be quite clever about how you arrange the groups. Getting people to work in small groups is like a really key feature of this, because it kind of diffuses the responsibility for who's said what, and it makes people generally a bit more confident about talking about it. I think that process of recognizing that people are going to have different goals and recognizing that you might want to have 3 different goals as a club is really important. And also, if you're like genuinely a club like Brighton Ultimate, for example, I think trying to identify people who want to lead on particular goals or who want to kind of support particular things is really useful as well, because I think you're typically understaffed at a kind of club committee or organizational level. So being able to get people involved in stuff that they really care about and that they're interested in, again, interest kind of feeds into some of those intrinsic motivations. So that's one way to do it. I think it is really challenging to run goal setting sessions. If you have some budget as a team or as a club, I really recommend working with a sports psychologist. Like, I can't recommend it enough. So if you're in Leeds, so I used to work at Leeds Beckett, and they have an amazing sports psychology department, and so many sports unis or sports psychology programs will have trainees who are in a position where they just want to do more stuff and want to run more things. So getting in contact with them, particularly if you're short on budget, they might be a bit cheaper than your kind of full-fledged sports psychologist, for example. So trying to find some places with, it will be called a Stage 2 sport and exercise psychology training program. But if you can find one of those local to you, then that might be a really good opportunity to get some proper professional facilitation. And I think the sessions that I've been to that are run by those professionals are so good, and it's so worth doing as a team. Like, I can't recommend it enough.
All right. Any more? Nope, I think that's it. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Hurst, for joining us. Final reminder for everyone for 2 things. Come to the webinar next week, because it's going to be great. They always are. And donate via the links right here. I'm not sure if you can see where I am on the screen, but they should be on the lower right of your screen or in the description below the video. So thanks again, Megan, for coming. And we will see you all next week.